So we're going to wrap up our discussion of civil liberties today by talking about the other amendments in the Bill of Rights. We talked last Thursday about the First Amendment. We broke down the various components because it is the most complex, it has the most parts to it. So we'll be moving on to the next part of it. Okay, so of course the Second Amendment is one that's somewhat controversial because essentially people don't fully understand what it says. When you look at the Second Amendment, the very first line says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary." So it was originally intended to provide local law enforcement at a time where we had no standing army and no police forces. It makes sense that you would want people to be able to own a gun to defend their communities. So the first part about a well-regulated militia often gets left out of the debate around guns. People tend to forget that that's part of the Second Amendment. So because it was originally intended to act as law enforcement, the Supreme Court didn't really do anything with it for 60 years. We've seen more discussion in the modern era with the National Guard, police at every level. We're seeing more discussion today on the role of the Second Amendment in our society. And by and large, gun laws are going to vary significantly from one state to another. For example, here in Texas, you have the right to concealed carry on a college campus. In Florida, that's illegal. And two examples of polar opposites in terms of gun laws are Wyoming and California. Wyoming has some of the most liberal gun laws. There's no waiting period. You can own any type of weapon that you want. And you don't need to get a permit to concealed carry. So basically, you can own a gun without any real restrictions. Whereas in California, if you want to own a gun, you can't buy an assault weapon. There's a 10-day waiting period. And you have to get a permit to concealed carry. So if you're going to move from one state to another, you're going to need to check the laws of the state you're moving to make sure you can bring that gun and what the requirements are for gun ownership in that state. There's also been questions around whether or not the Second Amendment gives us the right to own a gun for self-defense purposes. In the D.C. v. Heller case, Washington, D.C. is essentially a city. It's not a state, it doesn't have the same rights as states. The District of Columbia passed a law banning handguns within the District of Columbia. And it got taken up by the Supreme Court because D.C. is not really a state. I mean, it's not a state, it's just kind of a city. Usually if there's a challenge to a D.C. law, it gets taken up by the Supreme Court. So they struck down the ban and said that the Second Amendment does give us the right to own a handgun for self-defense purposes. So at the very least, people should have the right to own a handgun to defend themselves as needed. So even if we were to ban assault weapons, you can't ban handguns. So the fear-mongering that goes on sometimes about how one party or one politician wants to ban all guns, that's not very likely. That would probably get challenged, and the Supreme Court would side with the state and not the federal government on that. with this unclear rule on what type of guns we can have, we do unfortunately see quite a bit of an issue with mass shootings. Mass shootings are defined as a shooting where 4 or more people are injured or killed. So last year, there was the shooting in El Paso that killed 20 people. That's a mass shooting. Here in the U.S., the deadliest mass shooting in recent history was Las Vegas, Nevada, where the guy was firing his gun off the balcony of the hotel, killing 58 people. Followed by the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, where 49 people were killed. Virginia Tech in 2007, with 32. Newtown, Connecticut, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Parkland, Florida, and so on. So we do, unfortunately, see a bit of a pattern around issues with mass shootings and gun violence. And the debate around what types of weapons people should be allowed to use, more rules, things like that. So the Second Amendment overall is fairly controversial. And then the Sutherland Springs one was I believe that was the church shooting that happened in 2017. Yeah. Okay. So we're not really going to talk about the Third Amendment because we really don't see it being used in modern times. The Third Amendment essentially is the one that says you can't force people to house soldiers during peacetime. We don't really see that being an issue today, so we'll kind of move on to the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment is critical because it's what gives us what's called the exclusionary rule, where if evidence is obtained illegally, it cannot be introduced in a trial. This is the concept of fruit of the poisonous tree. So if the cops break into your house and see a bloody knife on the kitchen counter, even if they charge you with murder, that evidence cannot be used against you because it was not legally obtained. So this rule is the result of the Supreme Court case Mapp v. Ohio, M-A-P-P. What happened was the police forcibly entered Mrs. Mapp's house, claiming they had a warrant to look for a bombing suspect. They didn't find the suspect, but they found what they called obscene materials. He was then arrested and convicted for violating the state's obscenity laws. She sued and won. If you don't give the police permission to search your house, and if they don't have a warrant, anything they obtain has to be tossed out because it was not legally collected. So if the police show up at your house, ask for a warrant. Do not let them in without a warrant. Same with your car. You get pulled over, cop wants to search your car, tell them to get a warrant. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. If, for example, you've got a baggie of marijuana right where the cop can see it in the car, you're kind of going to be busted. Or if there's what they call extenuating circumstances, like if they hear someone screaming inside a house and they think that person's in danger, that's an exception to the rule about warrants. But overall, they can't search your house without your permission or a warrant. This also applies in situations where, let's say you're sharing an apartment with a roommate. If it's your roommate's name on the warrant, the cops are allowed to search the common areas like the kitchen, bathroom, living room, and that person's room. But they don't have permission to search your room unless you give them permission because your name is not on the warrant. So if your name's not on the warrant and they ask to search your room, you can tell them no. You can tell them not without a warrant. The police also have the ability to use what's called an anticipatory warrant. A warrant can be given if the cops know that some kind of incriminating material will be at someone's house or job, but it's not there yet. So they want to wait to execute the search warrant until they know that material is there. So as kind of an example of this, let's say Ivan is expecting a shipment of heroin at his house, and the cops know it's going to get there, but it's not there yet. They can be issued an anticipatory warrant, wait till they think the heroin has arrived, and execute the warrant. Now, the problem with this, from the cops' standpoint, is if you catch on to it, you can redirect the shipment and it's going to go sideways. But the idea is, you know there's going to be incriminating material, you just don't know when. So you have the warrant and you wait until you're reasonably sure you're going to get the evidence to execute the search warrant. Also, the Fourth Amendment applies to our rights in terms of cell phones and laptops. If you are detained and the cops ask to search your cell phone, you say not without a warrant. Same with your computer. If they don't have a warrant, they don't get to search it. They don't have a warrant, and if you don't give them permission, they can't search it. And if they do, it's rooted the poisonous tree. Now, the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect us from random drug testing. The court has said that drug testing of employees, especially federal employees, and student athletes is allowed. You want to make sure football players aren't using steroids, or that a Border Patrol agent isn't taking cocaine prior to showing up to work. So random drug testing is legal. So if you work for a company that does random drug testing, you're going to have to comply. There can be problems with a false positive. There was a case where a pregnant woman ate poppy seed bagel for breakfast and falsely tested positive for heroin at the hospital. Because poppy can be turned into heroin. So she had basically proof that she hadn't been using heroin, and then we had to go back and check it. So if you think there's an error, you can ask them to retest the urine or the sample, but you can't use to give a sample. In terms of technology, the cops can't attach a GPS tracker to a suspect's car without a warrant. They can't just decide to follow people if they think they may have committed a crime. They have to get a warrant for that. In terms of DNA, they are allowed to get a DNA swab if someone is arrested for comparison purposes. However, if the DNA does not match, they can't keep it on file. So they have to discard DNA if they test it and it turns out not to be a match. They can't put it into the database for later use. It has to be discarded. And of course, they have the right to run your fingerprints through the system. A lot of jobs require fingerprints. I did get fingerprinted to be a teacher, so if your fingerprints are on file, them's the breaks. We've also seen questions about things like stop and frisk. Stop and frisk was used largely in New York City, and essentially what it did was it allowed the cops to randomly search someone they deemed suspicious. What that led to, unfortunately, was a bit of a problem with racial profiling. It was young Black and Hispanic men who were being stopped more often than not. So the cities had to cut down on its stop and frisk policy, because how do you tell if someone's acting suspiciously, right? That's pretty objective. It can be hard to tell unless someone's like looking back and forth with cops and like edging away or something. You're not going to know that they're doing anything particularly. Also, if the cops do show up at your house and they have a warrant, call a lawyer. Make sure you get a lawyer there to help you understand what they're allowed to take versus what they're not allowed to take, what they're allowed to search or not. Read the warrant carefully, make sure you fully understand it. Okay, the Fifth Amendment is very important in a couple of different ways. First, because of the requirement to use a grand jury. You can't just try someone without supporting evidence. So in most states, a prosecutor will put together a group of between 12 and 20 jurors, individuals, who will then look at the evidence, hear some testimony, and decide if there's enough evidence for the prosecutor to issue an indictment. If there's not enough evidence, they won't file charges, and the prosecutor will have to try again. So they've got to make sure they have enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. And in states that don't have a grand jury, a judge has to decide if you can issue an indictment against someone. So you can't charge someone for murder, for example, without corroborating evidence. We also have protection in double jeopardy with a bit of a caveat. Now, double jeopardy originally used to just apply to the federal government. But then there was a case where a man was tried for murder and convicted and sentenced to life in the first trial. Prosecutor didn't like that, so he retried the man, got the death penalty, and then the man was executed. So now, on the state level, you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. So if you are charged with murder, but you're found not guilty at the trial, they cannot try you again. So hypothetically, if O.J. Simpson came out tomorrow and said, yeah, I killed my ex-wife, they can't do anything about it because he's already been tried and found not guilty. Now, the caveat with this is you can be tried for the same crime at the state and the federal level. So, for example, if you're convicted of human trafficking in Texas and the federal government wants to take a crack at you, that the court has said can be done. And there's a little bit of a gray area, but really we're only protected from double jeopardy by the states. Now, this doesn't apply if it's what they call a hung jury, where the jury can't reach a decision. If the jury can't reach a decision, then you can be tried again. But if you're found guilty or not guilty, they can't put you on trial again. We also have protections from self-incrimination through the famous Miranda warning. Now, the Miranda warning comes out from the 1966 Miranda v. Arizona court case. Ernesto Miranda had been, it's in 1966, right? 1966. He'd been arrested for rape. He didn't know he had the right to remain silent, so he confessed. And later, his lawyers successfully argued before the Supreme Court that he didn't know he had the right to remain silent. So that's where the first part of the Miranda warning comes from, the part about you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Now, the cops only have to give you the Miranda warning once. So if you're arrested at midnight and read your Miranda rights, and then they come back at 4 a.m. to talk to you again, they do not have to reread you your rights. So if you forget your rights in between, you're out of luck. They only have to give you that warning once. It also gives you the right to not incriminate yourself if you're testifying. So people can say things like, I plead the Fifth, or I assert my Fifth Amendment privilege. If you don't want to incriminate yourself during the trial, you can invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege, and the declined to answer. The Fifth Amendment also deals with what's called eminent domain. The federal government can take private property for public use. So let's say, for example, you own a house near the expressway, and the government decides they want to expand the expressway, so they're going to buy your house, basically take over your house and knock it down to build an extension. Two things have to happen. First, they have to give you enough notice so you can try to fight it in court. And two, if they do take over your private property, they have to compensate you for it. They have to give you fair market value. So if your house is worth something like $50,000, they have to give you pretty close to that in order to take over it. So they can't just seize your property without compensation. They do have to offer you some form of money and give you a chance to fight it in court. We've had cases where, like Washington, D.C. took over a grocery store in a rundown neighborhood saying we need to revitalize the city. That was allowed. But there was a very controversial decision in Kelo v. City of New London. New London, Connecticut wanted to seize private property and then turn it over to a developer to build private businesses for the city. And the city argued this will bring in a lot more money, it'll revitalize the economy, and the Supreme Court sided with the city. So they were allowed to seize private property for essentially private use. And then what ended up happening was the developer couldn't get the funding for the project, so it ended up getting abandoned. So we go back and forth on this issue. And we've also seen eminent domain coming up with the construction of the border wall. Homeowners, especially people who own farms and ranches, aren't happy with the idea of the federal government taking over their land to build sections of the wall. So if the government is going to seize your property, you have to be given the chance to appeal in court, and if you lose, they have to give you fair compensation for your property. So a pretty local example of this is, if you've been to the Walmart on North Texas, there's that house right next to it. Walmart tried to take that house, and I guess they're a cult that lives there, was able to successfully stop that from happening. So they actually won that fight, so they're allowed to stay there. I wouldn't go anywhere near that house, but they have the right to be there. Okay, any questions? Okay, any questions online? Okay. The Sixth Amendment contains some pretty important protections in terms of the trial process. Prior to the Gideon decision, if you could not afford a lawyer, you had to go it alone in court. Well, most people aren't familiar with the legal system. So in the Gideon case, the Supreme Court established that we do have the right to a lawyer. This is where two of the Miranda warning comes in. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. So everyone has the right to legal counsel in a criminal case. So this is where we saw the creation of the public defender's offices. Now, obviously, the quality of defense may not be as good as you have a public defender versus being able to pay a lawyer, but it still helps to have a lawyer. So if you are detained, first thing you need to ask is, am I under arrest? If they say no, you leave. If you are under arrest, the first words that need to come out of your mouth are, I want a lawyer. And you do not say anything else until your lawyer gets there. The minute you ask for a lawyer, the cops are not allowed to keep questioning you. So if you are arrested, you have the right to make a phone call. Call a friend, a family member, call someone, ask them to get you a lawyer, say you want a lawyer, and don't say anything else until your lawyer gets there. Make all the lawyer jokes you want, but make damn well ensure you get a lawyer. And don't let the cops tell you, you don't need a lawyer if you didn't do anything wrong. Get a lawyer. End of sentence. Don't play that game. Get a lawyer. You also have the right to a speedy trial. You can't charge someone with murder and then wait 5 years to try them. There are natural delays that occur in trials all the time, but you can't sit there and wait and wait and wait to try someone. That is a violation of the Sixth Amendment. So if you're arrested and you're not brought to trial, that's a problem. You got to make sure you get tried in a timely manner. You also have the right to an impartial jury. This gets tricky in high-profile cases. Finding the jury for O.J. Simpson was a matter of months. If it's a really high-profile national case, O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony, the Epstein case, finding an impartial jury can be very, very challenging. If you're afraid you can't get an impartial jury in your city, you can ask for a change of venue. But guaranteeing an impartial jury in a high-profile case is really hard. And sometimes you'll get challenges to a conviction where they say this person wasn't given the right to an impartial jury because most of the jury had already made up their mind. You also have the right to call witnesses for your defense. Character witnesses. People who can testify on your behalf and say, look, I know this person, I know where they were that day, I have to prove this person is not guilty. So essentially, the Sixth Amendment gives us the right to put up a fair fight, to defend ourselves as best we can if we're charged with a particular crime. We have to remember in really high-profile cases that the story we hear in the media may not be the same story in the courtroom, right? People were shocked when O.J. Simpson wasn't convicted, but it's like, well, the jury heard things that we didn't. So you gotta, keep that in mind. The trial by the media isn't the same thing as the trial by the jury. It's also why they ask petitioners a string of questions like, have you ever been the victim of a serious crime? Or what's your position on the death penalty? How do you feel about law enforcement? To try and make sure it's a fair and balanced jury. Now, they can't refuse to allow someone on a murder case who is opposed to the death penalty. They can't strike off a juror for opposing the death penalty in a capital punishment eligible case. And they also can't impanel an all-white or all-male jury, because clearly that's not going to be an impartial jury. And there was a case where an African-American man was convicted of murder by an all-white jury. And so they kept fighting it, and they put this man on trial like 6 times. And each time the conviction kept getting overturned for a hung jury, until finally they decided that it wasn't worth the hassle anymore, and they're just going to let the guy go. So that does unfortunately happen sometimes. So you want to make sure it doesn't. Okay. The Eighth Amendment also gets a little bit controversial because of people's opinions on this. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So you can't torture someone. You can't beat prisoners to get a confession. You can't waterboard someone. Well, there are exceptions, but usually not in the United States, right? We don't usually waterboard our people. Okay. And of course, we get questions about the Eighth Amendment in terms of whether or not the death penalty should be legal under the Eighth Amendment. For a while, the Supreme Court did put a halt to executions. Then in 1976, they allowed executions to resume. So in about a 40-year period, about 1,448 people were executed in the United States. And Texas does execute the most people in the United States. It's us, and then like Georgia, Oklahoma, and Florida, but we execute the most. And executions are carried out, I believe, on the last Wednesday of every month in Louisville at the death chamber. And of course, there's questions about, can you humanely execute someone? Obviously, there have been methods historically that were not humane. The electric chair, definitely not humane. Hanging, not humane. And the way people are executed, of course, can vary. In France, until they banned the death penalty, they used the guillotine, which was the device that would cut off your head. Basically, it was a sharp blade on a rope, and they took the rope and decapitate you. In Iran, India, and Pakistan, it's death by hanging. In Saudi Arabia, they're executed in public with a sword and decapitated. In some places, like Somalia, if you are convicted of adultery, you are buried up to your waist or neck, and then they throw rocks at you until you die. Here in the U.S., most executions are through lethal injection. There are a handful of states where someone can ask to be executed via firing squad instead, where they line you up and point guns at you and shoot you until you're dead. The problem with lethal injection is, if it works properly, it's a pretty humane form of execution. But there can be problems like finding a vein for someone who was a drug user and the scar tissue, or making sure you put in enough drugs to kill someone who's 250 pounds. Also, one of the drugs we were using is called phenobarbital, and the makers of the drug, who are not based in the United States, said, we're not selling to you anymore for executions. They didn't like that their drug was being used to execute people. So now we have to come up with an alternative cocktail to carry out executions. We are also the only Western country that still carries out executions. If you look at the statistics globally, we're on a list like countries with countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Cuba, and Sudan. So we are the only Western country that still executes people. Now, there are some limits on the death penalty. You can't be executed for rape. You cannot execute a defendant with an IQ less than 70 because they clearly can't understand what's happening. Probably couldn't understand what they did was wrong. They can't differentiate between right and wrong. And you also can't execute a defendant who was a minor when put on trial. So if someone is charged with murder at 16 and tried as an adult, you can't give them the death penalty. Also, you can no longer give minors a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In 2012, the Supreme Court said, you put someone at 17 in jail for life, that's a cruel and unusual punishment. If you're under 18, even if you're convicted as an adult, they have to give you the possibility of parole. They can't lock you up indefinitely. And there's also been times where the death penalty gets overturned because of DNA testing or finding out there was racial bias on the jury, things like that. Okay, another area that gets discussed with civil liberties is the right to privacy. Nowhere in the Constitution are we guaranteed a right to privacy. It's largely implied. So what the Supreme Court has done has used the 14th Amendment to expand a right to privacy in various areas. Birth control is one example. In the Griswold v. Connecticut case, the state of Connecticut did not allow doctors or nurses to discuss contraception or how to use contraception with anyone, including married patients. And so the Supreme Court struck that down and said, that's a violation of marital privacy. You don't have the right to tell a couple when or how many children to have. So they struck down the laws that wouldn't allow doctors to give married couples contraception. By the mid-1960s, they also expanded that to give single women access to the pill, because the pill became widely available in the United States in the 1960s. So no state can pass a law saying you can't discuss contraception or give single women contraception. Access to birth control is considered a fundamental right. We have the right to decide if and when we want children and how many. Abortion was legalized in 1973 in Roe v. Wade when the Supreme Court said women have a right to essentially bodily autonomy. There are some limits on abortion. For example, no abortion after 20 weeks in most states unless medically necessary to save the life of the mother. Mandatory waiting periods. Requiring doctors at clinics to have admitting privileges at local hospitals, and also restrictions on the ability for women under 18 to get an abortion without parental notification. Now, some states have tried to circumvent Roe, like Louisiana, and another state tried to pass a law that would outlaw abortion as soon as you start to see the formation of heart cells, which is at about 6 weeks, essentially outlawing abortion. And the Supreme Court, the federal court struck that down. If a state tries to circumvent Roe, the courts are going to say, no, you can't do that. You can restrict it, but you can't make it illegal. We've also seen an expansion of rights for the LGBT community. It wasn't until 2003 in the Lawrence v. Texas case that state sodomy laws were finally overturned. Prior to this, same-sex couples would be arrested for violating state laws on homosexual activity and thrown in jail. So in the Lawrence case, the cops went to execute a search warrant and walked in on two men having sex, and so they were arrested for violating state sodomy laws. And the court struck that down and said you cannot criminalize private homosexual sexual conduct. If it's two consenting adults, you can't put them in jail for that. They have a right to privacy just like heterosexual couples. You can't outlaw sexual activity between two consenting adults who happen to be gay. And then, of course, they've also expanded the right for same-sex couples to get married, and so on. And the court has not yet determined if we have a right to die. If we are terminally ill, whether or not we can ask a doctor to assist us in ending our own lives. They haven't said no, they haven't said yes. They've basically said, that's a matter for the state. So the right to die is kind of in a gray area. Some states, yeah, some states, no. The court may pick it up at some point, but for now it's just kind of left up to the states to decide. Okay, so in terms of civil liberties today, we are seeing some interesting things happening. The attitude of a lot of Americans post 9/11 has been the government is protecting us. Yeah, okay, maybe our civil liberties are being violated in some ways, but it's for our own protection. It's okay if we have to go through a body scanner at TSA, or we can't bring in water, or that there's cameras on almost every street corner. People tend to see it as the government protecting us and not the government violating certain fundamental rights. And we tend not to see people criticizing, for example, TSA unless there's some kind of egregious violation. We may grumble about it, like, oh, it sucks to take off our shoes, but we're not really pushing back that hard against it. And the reality is that we have to work to protect our own rights. Most people don't know what to do if they get pulled over by the cops, or they show up at your house, or you get arrested. So we have to protect our own rights. It's in the cop's best interest if you don't ask for a lawyer, if you don't ask for a warrant. You have to protect your own rights. You have to say, I want a lawyer. You have to say, come back with a warrant. You have to say, if I'm not under arrest, I'm leaving. You have to protect your own civil liberties. You have to be willing to speak up and say, I'm not going to allow this. I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not going to let this happen. But we do see people not exercising their rights because they're afraid the government will then start to follow them or keep an eye on them. And it's not completely unreasonable. With issues with the NSA spying on people, the fact that you're basically tracked to every website you go to, it's not an unreasonable fear. And also, sometimes people just don't think about their own best interests. You know, if the cops ask you to come in and answer a few questions, and you say, well, do I need a lawyer? And they say, not if you haven't done anything wrong. Most people would be like, yeah, okay, I haven't done anything wrong. I'll talk to the cops. When they should be thinking, I'm not going in here without a lawyer, right? People are sometimes scared to exercise their rights, but if you don't exercise your own rights, then there's no one to protect you. Cops aren't going to be like, you sure you want a lawyer? No, they're going to ask you once, and if you say no, that's it. So you've got to make sure you're protecting yourself. You've got to make sure you're asserting your own rights. And we do, of course, have concerns about how we deal with privacy as technology increases, what are we going to do if self-driving cars become very popular? If you get pulled over by the cops in a self-driving car, what are your rights going to be? What do we do about increasing usage of cell phones and technology? The courts have ruled that cops can't search your cell phone or laptop without a warrant or your permission, but obviously that's something that's had to come about with evolving technology. So the more technology increases, the more questions we're going to have about our right to privacy and protections from government overreach. So there's a lot of questions that we're still going to have to tackle, and it's just going to get, I think, a little bit more complicated. So remember, if you're detained by the cops, you do have the right to ask if you're under arrest. If they say no, you say thank you and you leave. If you are under arrest, they need to review your Miranda rights. If you are arrested, ask for a lawyer. Don't say anything until that lawyer gets there. Ask for your phone call a friend, a family member, call me, I'll get you a lawyer, and don't say anything until you get there. And if you happen to know a lawyer, great, call them, right? But just make sure you're protecting your own rights. They show up to your house without a warrant, right? They come back when you have a warrant. You do not have permission to search my car. You do not have permission to search my house. Make sure you're protecting yourself. And if any of you have kids and they get into trouble, once you're done smacking them upside the head, get them a lawyer and make sure they're protected, okay? Okay, any questions on that? Okay, any questions online? Okay. So I want to show you guys a clip from a movie called The American President. It came out in the early 1990s. Did the shipping, if you're familiar with that, and also The Newsroom. So this is a brief little clip I want to show you guys from the movie.
America is advanced citizenship. You've got to want bad, because it's going to put up a fight. Say you want free speech. Let's see you acknowledge a man whose words make your blood boil, who's standing center stage and advocating at the top of his lungs that which you would spend a lifetime opposing at the top of yours. You want to claim this land as a land of the free? Then the symbol of your country cannot just be a flag. The symbol also has to be one of its citizens exercising his right to burn that flag in protest. Now show me that. Defend that. Celebrate that in your classrooms. Then you can stand in the land of the free. I've known about it.
Sounds nice, right? Yeah, something we can primarily agree with. We can, yeah, okay. All right. Keep that in mind while you look. This is the Westboro Baptist Church. So this is what you will typically see if they show up to protest. Okay, so having looked at this, is this free speech? Yes? Not sure? Okay. Sorry? It is hate speech, but it's protected because I'm not directly advocating violence. She's not saying, go shoot queer people, right? She's not saying go hang them, right? She's not directly advocating for violence. Obviously, it's offensive to a lot of people, and they do tend to attract pesters. But even though what they're saying is highly offensive to a lot of people, nothing here directly advocates for violence. So it is protected speech. And as long as they follow the rules about staying inside the protest zone and things like that, they're allowed to be there. They're allowed to do that. Okay. So that is the great fun that is the Westboro Baptist Church. Okay. So it's a reminder that we don't have to like speech for it to be considered protected. But just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean you necessarily should, right? There can be consequences for what you say. So for example, if you walked in here at the beginning of class and said, "Yo, Dr. J, what up, cracker?" That's protected speech. But I control your final grade, so you probably don't want to do that, right? What you say can have consequences. If I walked in here and I called you guys a horrible racial epithet, technically that's protected. But if I went online and I said South Texas College is full of fill in the blank, that's not protected because then I'm making my employer look like they're complicit in this kind of comments. So it's a fine line between what's protected and what isn't. So here's my question for you guys. Should there be any limits on free speech? Any restrictions on free speech? This also applies for the online students. Do you think there should be limits on free speech? Okay. Eileen, do you want to share what do you think those restrictions should be? Okay, so they already apply, sure, to things like speech that incites violence, things like that. Yeah, absolutely. Right, you can't, yeah, instigate a fight, yeah. What about you guys? Do you think that the way the First Amendment is set up, it works like it should? That basically, unless it's something that directly is going to incite violence, you should have the right to say it? Yeah. And it does get into the issue of free speech versus censorship, right? On the one hand, you don't want people running around calling each other horrible names. On the other hand, you don't really want to be censoring speech because that's a slippery slope. You say you can't say this word, then the next day it's that one, and so on and so on, right? For example, in Europe, it's illegal to deny that the Holocaust happened. So if some public figure goes out there and says the Holocaust never happened, it's all a great big hoax, they can get into legal trouble for that. Here in the U.S., of course, they can't. But if someone went out in public and said, of course, they'd get an immediate backlash from a bunch of people going, what are you talking about? Here's this and this and this. So again, it's because you have the right to say it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. It doesn't mean that people won't hit you back for that. Like J.K. Rowling and her comments that were perceived as transphobic this summer, right? People criticizing her for her comments. That's gonna happen. Just because you say it doesn't mean people are gonna want to say something about it. Okay, let me ask you the other question. Do you think we should have the death penalty in the United States? It's a little bit more complicated question, I realize, but okay, Eileen, you think yes. Okay. There's no wrong answer. It's your opinion. Do you think we should still have the death penalty? Think yes? Okay. Why exactly, if you don't mind sharing? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. 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 The fact that it's reserved for murder cases only. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, and of course, the public is divided on this issue. The opposition to the death penalty usually takes the form of you can't bring someone back from the dead if they're innocent, right? You want to make sure that if someone is given the death penalty, that you're 99% certain that they're guilty, right? Like if someone, it turns out they didn't commit the crime, you can't do anything about that if they're dead. Two, that it can take a long time for executions to happen, 15, 20 years because of the appeals process, which can be very expensive because you have to segregate the death row inmates, which can be expensive. And the further argument that statistically speaking, we do tend to see that the death penalty is more often given to minority defendants than white defendants. And then, of course, you have the moral argument from the Catholic Church and others. It's murder, basically state-sanctioned murder. So there's a lot of back and forth, right? There's a lot on both sides that people can argue for and against. Yeah. Personally, I don't support the death penalty. I understand people want it, and I think if, like, one of my family members was murdered, I'd want to kill the bastard who did it myself, right? That's human nature. We want justice. But for me, I think the worst punishment that could be applied is to lock someone up for the rest of their life, throw away the key, and have society forget that they ever existed, right? Deny them the ability to be in the public's eye when it comes time for their execution. But that's my stance on the death penalty. I also tend to think that life without possibility of parole could be for some of the worst offenders, like serial killers, serial rapists, people like that. But that's my take on it, right? And my opinion, obviously, may differ quite a bit from others. But ideally, I'd either like to see no death penalty or reserved for the worst of the worst, like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, like serial killer types. That's just my take on it. So obviously, with civil liberties, there's a lot of room for discussion, a lot of room for debate. The overall point of civil liberties is that it's a way of protecting us from the government intruding into our lives, overreaching. It protects us from the government throwing us in jail and not trying us for a decade for a crime, or from walking into your house, taking something out, and you not being able to do anything about it. Civil liberties are the fundamental protection from the government intruding into our lives in a way that's harmful. It's a way of protecting us from the government overstepping its bounds and causing irreparable harm. So they are fundamentally important to who we are as a country. It's how our democracy works. There are checks and balances on the government, and there's also restrictions on what they can do to us. But we have protections, so the government can't just hang us out in the street corner. So they're critical to how we run as a country. And they're a way of protecting us from the government, making sure that we aren't being abused by the government. They're very, very important to making sure this country can work. Okay. Any questions, comments? No. Any questions online? Okay, so Thursday, we're going to start on civil rights. So you guys, of course, will be online and the other half will be in class. So read the first half of chapter 5 for Thursday. We're going to break down how civil rights have come about, the expansion of civil rights over time, and how we see civil rights working or not today. So remember, your paper proposal is due a week from Thursday. The Dropbox is open in Blackboard, so you can submit your paper proposal. If after next Thursday you want to change your topic, just let me know. But next Thursday, just make sure I have your topic, why you chose it, and your two sources. And it's due by 11:59 p.m., so you have until the end of the day next Thursday. Okay. Any questions on that? Everyone's good? Okay. Then I will see you next Tuesday in person, and I'll see